Observations are a fascinating method for data collection, sometimes used in management research, not as much as it is used in other fields, for example, anthropology or sociology. However, there is an upwards trend towards using this method, and it is part of the ethnography research design more often than not, sometimes part of action research, and even occasionally part of case studies. Observation can be defined as the method through which the researcher takes field notes on the behavior and activities of individuals at a research site. In doing so, the researcher is more or less immersed into that research environment, and indeed they can have different levels of involvement. For example, they can be participant observers or non-participant observers. Now, the clue is in the title. Participant observants are those taking part, an almost equal or fully equal part in the organizational life alongside other members of the organization, so alongside the people observed. Non-participant observers, however, tend to sit or stand aside of the action and simply note those interactions. The obvious issues in relation to both is that for the participant observation, there is a risk of losing a bit of the overall picture by getting perhaps too involved in a particular side of the picture, whereas for the non-participant observer, there is a risk that they may be influencing the environment and the interactions observed by simply choosing not to take part. It isn't every day in organizations that somebody just watches you intendedly and openly, and in such a case, I don't know how many of you and how many of us can claim that we are completely unaware or unaffected by such a presence. I've used observations in my PhD and also in 2 of my articles. I have to admit that it is difficult to publish research based on observations. I have to admit that it hasn't been very easy to persuade reviewers to publish my articles based on data emerging from observations, because obviously the method is highly subjective. Having said that, the method is indeed more and more used in management research, so reviewers are increasingly more exposed to it and more likely to accept articles based on such a method, and indeed on ethnography as a research design. As I mentioned, the researcher can take various roles in the organization in which they base those observations, ranging from complete participant to complete observer. So what we're doing now is adding just a bit more nuance, a bit more gray to the black and white dichotomy between participant and non-participant observations. So complete participants conceal the intention to study and observe the setting of the research by fully engaging themselves with the action observed. Participant as observer, this is a position through which doing observation for research is not concealed. However, the researcher still takes full part in the activities. In the role of an observer as participant, the researcher occasionally asks questions to gain understanding of the setting observed, but at the same time does take part in some of the interaction. Finally, the complete observer maintains distance to the object and the context under study to mainly observe the surroundings of that study. Now, this is one framework out of a few, but there is general consensus that the participation of the researcher in the setting being observed varies. It varies from one study to another, it varies from one researcher to another, but it also varies across the time in which the researcher stays with the organization. So in my case and in my PhD PhD, I went through all those 4 phases in this table. I was a complete observer at the start of the research, simply trying to understand the relationships and the best way to conduct the rest of the research. And then I started taking part in the activities observed just gradually. I never really got to the point of being a complete participant, in the sense that I never was able to conceal my intention to study the setting, and simply because I started as a complete observer. So by the time I got to being participant as observer, everyone in the organization knew what I was doing. So I did not get to that upper level of participation, and I would argue that very few of us ever do, because it does entail that decision to conceal one's intentions, and I will explain later why this can be problematic. Another way of looking at observations is by this classification from Easterby-Smith: researcher as an employee, research as an explicit role, interrupted involvement, and observation alone. Now, negotiating your role as a researcher employee is perhaps the most difficult of all options, because gaining access and agreement can be extremely difficult, and it can also raise ethical dilemmas, particularly if by choosing this role the real intention is to conceal the research being undertaken alongside employment. However, for some, this may be the only way to gain insights into an organization, and in some fields of work this may be acceptable. In mainstream management, it is not normally acceptable, however. Now, although there are some ethical issues connected with such a position, there is a growing acceptance that employees can be researchers. Therefore, from a philosophical stance, it can be argued that this is a legitimate way of gaining understanding of a phenomenon. For the researcher, it does pose the issue of an identity crisis, that so-called going native, and once one goes native, they may be losing that objectivity and that overview insight that is normally associated with research, academic or otherwise. This isn't a minor problem, it is indeed a very significant problem, and you may be able to fully appreciate it if you are to think of a situation in which you were newly arrived in an organization, and the kind of observations that you were able to make in that stance, and compare that with a few years later when you were fully immersed into the culture. You will probably notice that there will be fewer and fewer observations, close to very little reflexivity at all once you are fully embedded into that culture. Hence the real issue with this problem alongside the ethics concerns. Another role for the researcher is to just be a researcher, have an explicit role of an observer in the organization. This is negotiated in advance with management and preferably the employees as well. The risk of getting the management on board but not the employees is that the latter will not fully engage with you and really keep their interactions as per usual, allowing you to observe them. So you need to somehow find a way to get them on board as well. Interrupted involvement is something that most of us, for practical reasons, are able to do. In our research, the observer is present sporadically over a period of time. So that for me during my PhD was over 3 years, and I had sporadic involvement of a few months at a time, some more intensive than others and in different roles. This particular role is not one of continuous longitudinal involvement, but rather of involvement by phases. Finally, observation alone. This is hardly a qualitative method because the researcher avoids sustained interaction with those under study. I suppose this particular statement conceals a bias against this method. It simply does not seem very realistic for someone to be able to sit in the corner and collect data in this manner. It is sometimes legitimate in certain areas of study, and if you wish to understand whether or not this is something you could employ, you should be discussing it with your supervisor. It can be used in conjunction with other methods, so this is something you could consider, but on its own it is quite problematic, particularly because it is disliked by employees and prevents the degree of trust and friendship between researchers and respondents. And indeed, that trust and friendship are very important in allowing for the collection of qualitative data. I will end with issues with observations, particularly around semi-concealed research. I raised it earlier in this video. It isn't something you can take lightly. You need to really decide whether there is a real need for it, because it is largely unethical and it would need to be negotiated in a particular way. Although we say, apart from ethics issues, so negotiating ethics approval for participant observation can be problematic or simply challenging. You would need to put forward an observation pro forma, and as part of that you would need to isolate an object of research amongst that fluid reality that you are willing to get yourself immersed in. This is not an easy task, and it may feel at times like squeezing a circle in a square. So it isn't easy, but it is doable. So do discuss it with the ethics officer if it comes to it, because this one is likely to be an ethics approval project that is likely to come back to you. Now, on this pessimistic note, observations are an increasingly used method for collecting data, and although they come from fields such as anthropology and sociology, they find a place in management and business research, and especially when triangulated with other methods, you would be able to use it quite successfully in management. The practicalities of the method, however, will need to be given some thought in conjunction with discussions with your supervisors.